There have been few, if any, wedding invitations that I have ever turned down. A wedding invitation, whether it arrives in this sort of thick, embossed and colorful envelope, or comes by a simple word of mouth, I think carries with it an expectation. Not only are you asked to share in someone's joy, but you are invited to sit at a table that is prepared. To enter into a union that begins first by extending a welcome to those around them. In Jesus' day, right, a wedding banquet was not merely a private party like it is kind of today, but was actually a public declaration, one where honor and place mattered. And that's why Jesus, when telling the story about a wedding banquet, when seeing who is invited to a meal, pays close attention to where one sits and why. Hospitality, in a biblical sense, is a little bit different than our common understanding of hospitality. Our common understanding of hospitality in the sense that you're to be a good host, right? In ancient times, to receive someone into your home was to bind yourself to them in honor and in protection. Do you recall the story of Abraham? If you go all the way back to Genesis, my friends who are reading through Genesis right now are like, yes, we do, right? Where Abraham welcomes the strangers that come to meet him and sort of rushes out to them while they're under the oaks of Mamre, and he cares for them, right? He opens his home to them. This is the beginning of that understanding of the hospitality of Abraham that has been rendered into art. Or perhaps you'll remember when the widow of Zarephath, right, gave her last bit of meal to make food for the prophet Elijah. And what happened there after that offering of herself? Somebody said it. Tom's right. To extend hospitality, in a sense, was to affirm someone's dignity, yes, but it was also to protect and to serve the life that was theirs, and to declare, right, that for however long it takes, you are safe. Under this roof, your life matters. In this place, you are safe. This is a very sort of different practice, I think, than when most of the time we go to someone's house. That hospitality is seen as something that is quite temporary, yes? There's a time limit, right? Everybody knows when it's time to leave a party, yes? Well, maybe some of us. Right? There's a line when you can wear out your welcome. And sometimes we manage that with a meal or a form of entertainment, but there's this polite understanding, I think, between us. And though we ascribe a sense of neighborly love to that encounter, it's different than the understanding, I think, of neighbor in which the ancient Hebrew people thought of neighbor, where time really wasn't something that mattered so much as that if you came into my house, you became an extended part of myself, and all of that means. And so in the ancient world, protection was not simply about just securing the perimeter at night, making sure all the goats were like in the pen, right? Making sure the front door was locked. To offer someone shelter, to invite them into your home, meant staking your honor on their well-being, connecting yourself to them in a very, very intimate way. Protection meant that you matter enough that I will stand in the breach for you, that they have to come through me to get to you, whoever they is. And I think that's what makes the prophets so insistent about what they are preaching to Israel. Jeremiah cries out, because Israel has abandoned her covenant of protection. And terrible things will result because of their decisions. There are consequences, in other words. And the people that should have sheltered the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the strangers, instead have put all their energy into idols. They have kept idols close rather than the people they are to care for. They kept their idols safe versus the people that they were meant to keep safe. And we know idols. Then and now, idols never protect. They only consume. And so who we protect, what we guard, what we regard, reveals what we value. And what we value reveals what our hearts truly treasure. You remember Jesus, right? Wherever your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so Jesus gives this image of maybe people scrambling for the best seats at a banquet, and asks, I think, through that parable, what does this reveal to us? Perhaps, in some sense, that they thought their worth was tied to some form of recognition, right? That honor and not humility define their lives. That would certainly be in line with this idea of hospitality, this connection with honor, but in a weird way. Jesus teaches, when you are invited, go and sit at the lowest place. Because in God's household, honor flows not from self-advancement, but through grace and humility. And so, we know this to be the truth. We know what we value by what we choose to sacrifice. What can I not live without? What's the first thing you're going to grab in the house if it catches on fire? And we know what our culture values by who we are willing to protect and who we are willing to sacrifice. Especially when we place them on what the nation, read both Israel and America, has deemed worthy to place on the altar of freedom. I'm reminded of a section in the Psalms. This is kind of deep in the Psalter, where there is this lament that is often hidden. And it's hidden because perhaps it is a little too painful. If you turn into the Psalter and you go to Psalm 106, there the psalmist confesses one of Israel's darkest failures. They sacrificed their own sons and daughters to idols. They killed their little boys and their little girls. Children, in a sense, were seen as expendable to deity. They were already treated as property. And history, we know, because we've had educations in this room, that history bears witness to what happens when children are seen as objects, whether they're objects of a particular economic structure, right? Whether they are pawns, right, for political gain, or what happens to them through cultural neglect. What we know is that violence will follow that. And it has. It has. And so we gloss over this all the time. And so into that world, right, into that context, Jesus speaks a very radical word. Right? He says, in a sense, that children are not property per se. They're not bargaining chips. They're not expendable. As a matter of fact, like when he's around a bunch of adults that have been following him for a long time, there's some children in tow. And he takes a child and he places the child in the midst of them. And he says flat out to the adults in the room, whoever welcomes this child welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. And so he takes someone at the lowest place and places them on a higher plane. And I'm gonna go out on a limb here. There's a lot of moms in the room here, so you can come at me right now if you want. I don't know. But what that teaching says to me, right, is our children. And I'll just use my children. Morgan. Morgan is not Teresa, and she's not just our child wholly in terms of possession. Right? My children, our children, are God's own. They are entrusted to our care as parents. They are our heritage, as the psalm says, a gift from the Lord. And to tend them is not to merely keep them fed and alive, but a remarkable call to nurture them, to love them, to help them grow in awareness, wisdom, courage, and joy. And most of the time, they end up teaching us things. But what happens when that protection fails? Some of you in this room will recall news out of Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. 4 little girls were killed in the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church. They were in church. They were preparing for worship. And as a child I know personally who came to the revelation while being there, mentioned that they were killed while they were praying. That tragedy, through the grit of grace, only grace, stirred a conscience of the nation and propelled the civil rights movement forward. It did this because the violence of that moment, when the bomb blew that church apart, revealed with clarity what had long been rationalized. That segregation was not just a social arrangement, but a system willing to sacrifice children to maintain an idolatrous notion that division rather than unity would somehow yield truth and protect freedom. I thought about that revelation of my friend John's this week when I encountered the news of the school shooting in Minnesota. And I thought about so many places since Birmingham, where children and teachers have been killed while they were learning, and some while they were praying. And whether by bombs or by bullets, whether in churches, schools, or sanctuaries, the truth is the same. That children are being sacrificed, and not to God. And as I thought about that, as I prayed about that, I realized that Jesus kind of doesn't mince words to those who are listening to him in his context, and maybe even our own. That if any of us put a stumbling block before one of these little ones, it would be better for us if a great millstone were hung around our neck and we are thrown or cast or drowned in the sea. And what my prayers reveal in that moment, and I imagine some of you have been there, is that I'm reminded that the millstone, that great heavy thing, it's not just for those who pull the trigger or for those who light the fuse. It's also for those who rationalize what is irrational, who excuse what is inexcusable, who fail to take responsibility, and who choose willingly to look away from causality, consequences, patterns, and dare I say, shut our eyes in the face of our own limitations as fallible people. Every time a group of people gathers together and says, violence is just the cost of our freedom, we sacrifice something very precious. Every time we refuse to examine the systems that feed violence, whether it's through ease of access, mental illness, or culture that glorifies zealous ideals. I hope you know this. We are attempting to fill Jeremiah's cracked cisterns. And what flows out of those cracks is not just living water, but blood. Jesus envisions a community where, I think in his invitation, that protection is extended not to those who can secure their own safety, but to those who cannot. Right? The kingdom of God is a banquet where the vulnerable are not sacrificed, but that they're honored. Where children are not property, but gifts. Where freedom is not defined by the fact that we may have the right to do whatever we want, but by the responsibility to protect those who need us to. So is there something different beyond Minnesota? I don't know. I know that we surely cannot resurrect those children, but I think we can honor their memory by refusing ourselves to continue to rationalize tragedy. I think we can be a church that names idols for what they are, as difficult as that may be, because that will challenge what we value. And we can teach our children not only the stories of Scripture, but the truth that their lives are infinitely valuable and worthy of love and protection. We can hold our leaders accountable, not shrugging when violence erupts and sending our thoughts and prayers, but insisting that responsibility, causality, and consequences are taken seriously. And I think we as a church, particularly St. Luke's, can model a different kind of banquet. I think we already do. but we can also practice a hospitality that risks. We can offer protection that costs. And we can give compassion that endures. We can, in this community, in Bartlesville, partner with institutions and schools and other churches, with people in our own community that want to extend the radical invitation of Christ, that no child will ever be treated as expendable again. We can and we should do this. Or we will forever be answering yes to the question, shall we choose our own millstone?